We've been in this series, Best Sermon Ever, and it's not my sermon that's the best ever. It's Jesus' sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, and we made it through chapter 5. Praise God, right? And so we have chapter 6 and chapter 7 left, and you say, oh my goodness, is this ever going to end? Yes, we'll finish 6 and 7 in the same amount of time, roughly, that it took us to do chapter 5. And so the headings are a little bit shorter. And if you've been with us for all of the messages so far, you remember that Jesus started with the Beatitudes. He tells us who in this world is really blessed. We have our idea of people who are blessed, but Jesus says it's not the world's view that matters, it's my view. And here are the people who are very blessed. And he gives us that list. And then he encourages us to be salt and to be light. And then he goes into what we've been in for quite some time now, maybe 6 weeks or so. He goes into what we call the antithesis. And he says, this is what the Pharisees tell you, but this is what I say. This is the true intent of what they're getting at. And so his intent is that we not just do things or that our actions just reflect, but he wants our heart to reflect our actions. If our heart's right, our actions will follow through. And so that's what he's getting at here. He wants to change our hearts. And so we went through all 6 of these, and he says, you know, I want you to resolve your anger. He says, I don't want you to have any sexual desire for anybody other than your wife. And so he talks about lust. He says, I don't want you to get a divorce for just any reason like the world does. And he talked about divorce, and he says, you know, I don't want you to take oaths. I want your words to just be truthful at all times. And then he gets into retaliation. He says, I don't want you to retaliate against anybody. And then he takes it one step further, and he says, in fact, I want you to love even your enemies. And so that's just a short summary of where we've been. The messages are available online if you want to listen to those. Now that we hit chapter 6, the focus shifts just a little bit. In chapter 5, he focused on what the Pharisees said and what they taught. Now as we get into chapter 6, he's going to start focusing on what the Pharisees do. So in chapter 5, he focused on the Pharisees' words. Now in chapter 6, he's going to focus on their actions. And the theme of chapter 5 was really how to lead a righteous life. And that continues throughout chapter 6. The theme is the same, but the focus is just a little bit different. And so in chapter 5, Jesus said, these are the things that you ought to look for in your life. And you ought to do these things to lead a righteous life. But now in chapter 6, he says, doing those things is not enough. You've got to do them with the right heart and with the right motives behind it. And so as we get to chapter 6, or in chapter 5 rather, he said, you know, these are the things you could do that other people can see. But now as we get to chapter 6, he says, these are the reasons you should do it, and only I can see those reasons. And so Jesus is telling us, you know, what he's really saying is motive matters. And that's the title of the message today if you're taking notes. Chapter 5 focused on our outward behavior. Chapter 6 focuses on our inner heart. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to do a little bit of skipping around this week. Don't worry, we will pick up anything I skip over. But let's begin with Matthew 6, beginning at verse 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Jump down to verse 16. It says, and when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So he hits on three tenets of the faith. He hits on giving to the poor. He talks about prayer, and he talks about fasting. If you're a person that underlines in your Bible, I do that, there are some words I want you to underline. It's actually one word, and it's repeated about 6 times. The word is when. And you see it in verse 2, verse 3, verse 5, verse 6, verse 16, and verse 17. It says, when you give to the poor, when you pray, when you fast. And you have to remember, Jesus is talking to his disciples when he's giving this message. So he doesn't say, if you pray. He doesn't say, if you give to the poor. He doesn't say, if you fast. He says, when, which assumes that we ought to have all 3 of those things in our walk with Christ at some point in our lives. Jesus assumes that his followers are doing those 3 things already. But now he says, it's not just about you doing them, it's about how you do them. It's about what your motive is behind doing it. It's your motivation behind these things that really matters. He doesn't want his disciples just going through the motions and praying and saying, okay, I prayed, check mark. Okay, I've fasted, check mark. Okay, well, I've done this, check mark. And he sure doesn't want them saying, hey, guess what I'm doing? I'm fasting because I'm holy. When's the last time you fasted? 30 years ago. I guess I'm holier than you. That's what he's talking about here. That's what he's getting at. He not only wants us to do what's right, but he wants us to do what's right for the right reasons. And so he takes it a step further. He wants these actions to flow from hearts that are motivated to serve him, that love him so much that they just flow naturally. It's not something you're doing to receive the glory of your neighbors in church or anywhere else. He wants these actions to flow from a heart that is truly motivated to do the right thing for the right reasons. And so that's what he's talking about here. Throughout this passage, he challenges his disciples. He says, search your hearts. Look at your motivation. Why are you doing these things? And he wants them to make sure their actions are being done for the right reasons. Jesus knows that it's possible for people who attend church to be self-deceived. And he knows how easy it is for some of his followers to go about their activities and to do these things, but really not attend to their hearts. And he says, I don't want you to just do these things. That's religion. I want you to have a relationship with me. I want you to do them for the right reasons. And so if they're right with the Lord, some people are deceived into thinking, I just need to check these boxes. And that's not what it's about. And so we can't just go through the motions of doing what looks righteous just because that's what we think we have to do. We can't do what we think is righteous just because that's what we think we need to do. Our righteousness has to flow from a changed and a heart that loves God. It's interesting to me that the examples are giving, they're praying, and they're fasting. And if you think about it, what he's really saying is check your motives towards others, check your motives towards me, God, and check your motives towards yourself. If you think about that, when you give, you're giving to somebody else. So you're checking your motives there. When you pray, it's a relationship with God, right? And so you're checking your relationship with Him. And when you fast, it's you giving up something. So you're checking your own motives. But here's the interesting thing about it. We're also checking our motives towards Him, right? Because when you give to the poor, that's money that's in your pocket. If I take, and I take all the money in my wallet, and I say, here you go, sleep in heavenly peace. Here's all this money here. Please don't give us cash. That's a bunch of steps we have to do. But if you take that out, you give that, then that's money that I don't have, right? You say, why do you have cash? Because we eat at Gringo's all the time, and it's cheaper if you pay cash at Gringo's. And so that's why I have cash in my wallet, so that I can pay dinner at Gringo's. If I don't have that cash, I don't eat at Gringo's because I'm not paying 2% more to use my card. That's money out of my pocket. I've got to rely on God to replenish that, right? If you're praying, what are you doing? You're saying, I can't do this. Whatever it is you're praying about, you say, I cannot handle this on my own. So God, now I'm turning to you. I'm at the end of myself. Now I'm turning to you. And again, it's a reliance on God. And when you're fasting, you're saying, I'm not going to eat. I'm going to skip a meal. And God, I know that that's not healthy for me sometimes. I know that I can't survive without food for a lengthy amount of time. So God, I'm going to rely on you. All three of those things check our motives towards others, but all three of those things check our motives toward God as well. Jesus gives us this harsh warning in verse 1. He says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. The word beware means this is pretty important. And have you ever seen a sign that says, beware with something good? You know, beware, golden fried chicken ahead. Beware, a lot of money in the road up ahead. No. You know, it's beware, falling rocks. Anybody ever been to Knoll? That scared me to death as a kid. Beware, falling rocks. I'm thinking one of those boulders is going to land on top of our car. Beware, electrocution hazard. It's never a good thing. And so that's what he's saying. He's saying, beware. You've got to beware, because if you don't beware, something bad is going to happen. He's saying, beware, because if you don't, something is coming that is going to harm you. If you're doing good things just to gain the approval or admiration of others, what he's saying is, then you have no reward from God. And what happens is every action someday, the Lord says we're judged for. And he says they go through this fire that cleanses and that purifies, and they come out either burnt up in the fire, which means they were for somebody else, or they come out as they were genuine for Him. And so that's what we're getting at here. There are some pastors that you watch online or you watch on TV. And when their works go through the fire, you're going to see that nothing comes out, because they're not doing it for the glory of God. They're doing it for the applause of the people whenever they play the organ and get everybody going so that they're all yelling and cheering. That's for them. And you'll see that when we get to heaven. You'll see Christian musicians who are not there to lead people into the presence of God, which is what Christian musicians are supposed to do. They're there for their glory. They're there because you get an adrenaline hit when people are cheering for you. And so that's their purpose of being there. And you're going to see people whose works come through the fire, and they're like, wait a minute, where's that concert I did in Houston? That was huge. And it comes through and there's nothing there. There's no reward. Now you got to be clear. They do get a reward. But the reward is right here on earth, is what Jesus is saying. You got your reward. Thousands of people clapping for you. Thousands of people cheering for you. He says that is your reward. Jesus says they don't get a reward. He doesn't say they don't get a reward at all. What he says is you don't get a reward from who? Your Father in heaven. And that's the difference. The point is, they get exactly what it is that they're looking for. There are a lot of people out there that just look for glory from other people. And when that comes through the fire, you're going to see that. You're going to see it. And it's the scariest verse in the Bible says that there are going to be some people that said, Lord, what about this? What about this that I did for you? Don't you remember I preached that tent revival? Thousands came down to the altar and were saved. Don't you remember, God, I prophesied in your name. I gave these prophecies, and everybody watched them on YouTube. And everybody was just so impressed. And he's going to say, you got your reward. Everybody was impressed. Depart from me. I never knew you. And that's not me saying that. That's what the Word says. And so it's scary. One more thing before we look at these areas. Sometimes people look at this verse and they think that Jesus contradicts himself. We didn't preach on this passage in this series because I just preached on it in February. But you remember Jesus said, let your light shine. Do these works before men. You remember when we went over that back in February? And so Matthew 5:16 says, let your light shine before others that they may see your good works. And they say, wait a minute, there's a contradiction here, because now he's saying that you shouldn't do that. No, there's no contradiction at all. Read the rest of verse 16 in Matthew chapter 5. He says, when we let our light shine before others, that they may see our good works. So now he says, when he says that, then he follows it up with this, that they may give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So you're letting those good works flow out, not so they see you and say, oh man, that's really awesome that Shanna's doing this or that somebody's doing this. No, it's that they'll see God and that they will praise. That's the difference here. It's the motive behind it. Motive matters. And that's what he's talking about here. When you're doing those works for the sake of everybody else, so that Bob thinks I'm holy, then that's what he's saying. That's not right. The motive behind it. If we're seeking God's glory with for righteous deeds, then we're doing them with the right motives. If we're seeking it for our benefit, then that's not the right motive. So let's go through these. 3 examples. Giving to the needy. Verse 2 says, thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, not if, when, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Jesus says when you give, don't sound a trumpet. Now, wouldn't it be pretty cool if when we pass the offering bag, that's why we do a bag, because we used to pass plates at my old church, and you could see everybody's check right on top. I know that Sister So-and-so gave $200 because her check's right there. And I wondered, do you just lay it on top? I'd always fold mine when I had a check. And so we use bags. But wouldn't it be awesome if our ushers, we have the teenagers, I do a lot of times, do it. Wouldn't it be awesome if Drew, who plays trumpet, brought his trumpet and he say, okay, what's your check? And if it's like $10, he blows 1 note. And if it's 6 figures, he blows 6 notes. Wouldn't that be cool? Now, no, Jesus says not to do that, right? So we can't do it. Although as fun as it would be, we just can't do it. That's what he's talking about here. He's saying you wouldn't want that to happen in church. And so he's saying don't do it yourself. He's talking about giving to the needy in this instance. He's not talking about the offering plate. I just used that as kind of a silly example. But the same principle applies. Jesus says don't shout and say, man, look how big this one is that I'm putting in today. He says that's giving with the wrong intent. Don't get on your Facebook and post a picture of your check to the church or Sleep in Heavenly Peace, and it's one of those big cardboard checks, with $100,000 made out. If you're giving that to the church or Sleep in Heavenly Peace, let us do that for you, right? I mean, if it's $100,000, that's a joke. What he's saying is, when you do that, when you talk about what you're giving, when you're posting it out on social media, I gave this much, he's saying that's for your glory. And you're going to get what you want. You're going to get people saying, man, that's so generous. He says that's your reward. But he says when you get to heaven, don't expect a reward from God because you already got your reward right here on earth. Think about it this way. A business that gives to a charitable organization may hold a big press conference, right? And they may have one of those big checks. Why do they do that? Because they want people to know that they've given that. They want them to know they're a charitable organization. What's their goal there? To let people know we're a charitable organization. We give money to charities. We're very generous. And that's what they're seeking, right? Some people won't even advertise. They'll just do that. And people will respect that so much. That's their advertising strategy. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's their reward, right? You shouldn't expect a different reward. And that's what he's saying here. He goes so far as to call the people who are blowing trumpets over their giving hypocrites. And that's a strong word. What is a hypocrite? It's essentially an actor. It's really what the word means. Somebody pretending to be something that they're not. And that's the word Jesus uses here. He's saying that the religion of the Pharisees is not genuine. He's saying, yeah, you may think they're so righteous, but they're not. And he says it's just a theatrical religion. He says they're hypocrites, they're actors. And their religious activities are done to impress not God, but man. And so that's what he's talking about here. And so he says something funny. How many of you know Jesus wasn't just some stuffed shirt that didn't have a sense of humor? He was funny. He was. He related to people. To relate to people, you have to be funny sometimes. And Jesus was, and he says, when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So what's that? I guess put it behind your back. If we see you doing this, we know you're giving, right? Was he being literal? No. Here's what he's saying. He's saying sometimes you need to forget the gift that you're giving. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, because sometimes it's not an issue that you're giving to make somebody else impressed. But sometimes when you give, you're going to be so impressed with yourself that it's going to lead to issues. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. If you give $1,000, and that's a lot of money. If somebody stuck it in the offering plate, I'd be like, whoa, that's $1,000. If somebody gave that to an organization, I'd be like, well, that's a lot of money. He says, don't think about it. If that's you that gave it, don't think about it. Because what you'll do is you'll say, man, I gave $1,000 to First Assembly. Man, I gave $1,000 already to Sleep in Heavenly Peace. Man, and you see the problem there? It's I. Your pride can get in the way. Pride comes what? Before fall, right? And so Seek the reward of God. That's what he's saying here. He's saying, don't seek your own glory. Don't trump it up in your mind either. He's saying, seek the pleasure of God, not your own pleasure, not the pleasure of somebody else. Seek the favor and the blessing of God. It's not about self-righteousness. It's not about pride. And it's not about self-congratulation. He says it's about God. And it's about blessing Him and thanking Him. There is a reward when you do give. But it's only if you give in the right way, with the right motives. You're giving for somebody else, I'll be glad to pat you on the back. But that's your reward. But if you're giving for God, He'll reward you in heaven. Second thing's prayer. He turns to prayer. He says, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because they're the same. But there are a few things we need to look at. He says, when you pray, that means you're praying, right? Not if you pray. You're praying at some point in time. He expects us to pray. But Jesus says there's a right way and there's a wrong way to pray. And in fact, next week we'll get into the model prayer that He tells us we should pray like. And so He says, don't be like the hypocrites. He says they're standing there on the street corner and they're praying. Why? So that others may see them. So that they may be seen by others. The Pharisees prayed a lot of times just so people would say, man, that guy must be close to God. His prayers are so awesome. Did you hear the theology? I mean, that was like a theology lesson in his prayer. Man, that guy must know a lot. Man, he must be close. And Jesus said, he's not praying to God. He's praying to you all out here. And he's got his reward already. And that's what he's talking about. And so the Pharisees loved to pray standing on the corner where everybody could hear them. And so they received the praise of people, and that's their reward. That's what they were seeking. There's nothing wrong with standing and praying. Listen, sometimes on Sunday nights, sometimes on Wednesday nights, I'll have somebody close us in prayer. There's nothing wrong with standing up and praying a prayer. That's what we ask you to do. Here's the difference. The word that's used here means those people were striking a pose. Madonna used to do Vogue on the video. I was young when that came out, so I remember that. I can't do Vogue. But that's what it means, is strike a pose. You strike a pose, and so you're out there, and it's like, oh, Jesus, thou art. You ever heard people praying King James language? Thou art the holiest God. Thou art. And he's saying that's a show. You're acting. You're not doing it to pray to God. You're doing it to pray for others' benefits. And so here's the question we have to ask ourselves. Are we praying because we want other people to think we're holy? Or when we pray, are we directly speaking to God? And that's what He wants. If we pray in our secret place, that's what He says. He says, this is the remedy. Pray in your secret place. And He said, then you don't have to worry about whether you're praying for somebody else. You ever notice that slips in sometimes? Hey, it's a temptation for me as the pastor. You say, really? Yeah, you ever heard me keep preaching during a prayer? I'm like, oh, I forgot that. I'll just say it in the prayer. I'll admit I do that sometimes. Every pastor does. Right, Pastor Dave and Ron? They're like, nope, not us. That's just you. We do it, and I got to catch myself. I got to check myself, and I got to say, no, I should have said that in the sermon, because I'm not praying to God. I'm praying so that they hear and hear the rest of the sermon. I forgot to say that. Listen for that. I mean, check that in your life. Are you praying to God, or are you praying to others? If our God hears, that's what we're looking for. And here's the thing about praying. It's not about how long you pray. It's not about the words that you use. It's no magic words. It's not about your vocabulary using long words. It's not even about the number of words in your prayer. What it's about is that you are honestly taking your needs to God. And you can pray a short prayer, "Help me, Jesus," and it can be just as sincere as a 30-minute prayer. Now don't get me wrong here, that you need to be spending time in prayer with God. But it's not the length, it's not the vocabulary, it's your heart towards Him. It's that you are seeking Him. He wants us looking to Him in faith, and He wants us believing that He's going to answer our prayers. And so that's what He says. Go to your inner room. Pray to your Father who is in secret. And He tells us how to pray. We're going to look at that next week. Last thing is fasting. He assumes that we will fast. It says when you fast. Not if you fast, when you fast. It's probably safe to say this is one of the most neglected principles of the faith amongst all of us. If I took a survey, when's the last time you fasted? Some of you would probably answer never. Some of you would probably answer several years ago. Some of you, would have done it recently probably. What do we mean by fast? You don't eat. I mean, whether you fast, some people will fast a meal. A true biblical fast is you don't eat anything all day long. And so some people will do that. Some people will fast a meal, though, at different times. You say, what do you mean by fast? You just don't eat. Think about it. You know what it means because we have a whole meal named after it. Breakfast, right? What does breakfast mean? Well, you fast overnight. Nobody, unless you're a sleepwalker, gets up and eats Doritos, while you're sleeping. You're fasting. You're sleeping, you're fasting. When you get up, you put that apple or bacon or pancakes or waffles or whatever it is into your mouth. What are you doing? You're breaking the fast. Break fast. Breakfast. Break fast. That's what it means. I mean, that's what it means in my mind anyway, whether that's what they intended it for or not. Why do we fast? Well, in the New Testament you look, if you're grieving, some people will fast. If you're praying about something very serious, some people will fast. If you're seeking the Lord's will about something, people will fast. And so you see fasting come in certain situations, and those are the three big ones, but there are certainly other areas where you could fast as well. You should fast whenever you're in spiritual agony. You can't make a decision. You don't know what God's plan is. Sometimes you need to fast. You remember Jesus came down from the Mount of Transfiguration and He found His disciples trying to cast this demon out. And the disciples couldn't get this demon out. And no matter what they did, this demon was just still manifesting himself. And Jesus walks down, and He just casts that demon right out. And they say, "Hey, why couldn't we do that?" And He said, sometimes these things only come with prayer and fasting. And so sometimes the big things in your life, listen, I'm not saying you got to fast to say, "Oh, what should I have for dinner tonight? I guess I'll fast to think about it." No, you just can't make a decision. That's not fasting. You fast when, man, I've got a cancer diagnosis. I am believing God for a healing. Fast. Man, I've got this going on. I can't make a decision. Man, I need God's favor. Fast. That's where He's talking about. And so there's a right way to fast and there's a wrong way to fast. What is the goal of fasting? Well, Jesus tells us what the goal is not. And that goal is not that somebody says, "Oh, Pastor Jeremy's getting pretty skinny. He must be fasting." No, I'm not doing it for your glory. I'm doing it to get alone with God. And that's what He says here. Because what these guys would do is they would put ashes on their head and they would get in their raggedy clothes and they did it 2 days a week. It was Tuesday and Thursday, I believe, were the market days for the Jews. And those days they would not take a bath. They would not comb their hair. They would just walk in and they'd be in their raggedy night clothes or whatever. Maybe they rolled around in the dirt a little bit. I don't know. But they wanted people to see, man, these guys must be holy because look how filthy they are. Man, they must really be sacrificing to God. And today, And that was their goal. And he said, you've got it. You've got it. They think you're holy. That's your reward. He says, even though fasting pleases God, your goal should be to please God, not other men. And if you're not doing it for the right motives, it's not the right thing to do. And so the Pharisees, what they did was they took this expression of devotion and a closeness to God, and they just maimed it. And the goal was that everybody else would see them. Jesus said, don't be like them. He says fasting is just a voluntary thing that's between you and God, and you do it on your own without trumpet, without fanfare. Now let me just say something about that. There are some times you do have to say, I'm fasting. But here's the intent behind it. It's not that, if Pastor Ron invites me out to lunch, I say, oh, Pastor Ron, I'm fasting. I'm holier than you because you want to go to lunch. That's the wrong way. But if I say, Pastor Ron, I can't go to lunch because I'm fasting, my intent is not to trump myself up. My intent is to let Pastor Ron know I'm not going to lunch, and it's not because I don't like you, it's because I'm fasting. See the difference there? And so that's what Jesus is talking about here. And let me just say one more thing, because this kind of goes along with that. If you're fasting like that, don't sit there in judgment of people who aren't fasting. Just because you're fasting, you're seeking something. Maybe God spoke to you and said you need to fast. That doesn't mean He spoke to somebody else. And that doesn't mean somebody else is going through the right. So the reverse is true too. Don't think you're holier than somebody because you're fasting and somebody else isn't. It goes both ways. So let's sum up the message today. Jesus is saying, seek God's favor. Everything you do, don't do it for man, do it for Him. Seek His reward. Seek His pleasure, not what everybody else wants you to do. And He's now diagnosed the problem of the Pharisees. Through chapter 5 and through chapter 6, He says, here's their problem. He says, what's their problem? Religiously, they think that they can earn their way up into heaven. If they give enough money, if they pray long enough, if they fast so that everybody can see, then it's almost like it's steps that they're climbing. Jesus says, no, that's not the way it works. He says it's all dependent upon me. And we see that as we go through the rest of the sermon. Isn't it interesting that from verses 1 through 18, the word Father is repeated no less than 18 times, or 10 times, I mean. Here's what He's saying when He does that. He's saying the deficiency in the Pharisees is that they really don't understand God as the Heavenly Father. He's saying they're trying to earn their way up in. They're trying to impress other men. But they really don't get it. That's what He's saying here. He's saying really what they're doing is they're attempting to manipulate the Father. They're thinking that they can, if they give enough, He'll say, oh, well, He did give a lot of these things, and so if He, He really gave a lot to the temple, and so He ought to just be in heaven. He's saying these things that they're doing, they're really trying to manipulate God when what they need is a relationship with Him. And there's a difference there. He says, you remember this when you give. You remember this when you pray. You remember this when you fast. And you check yourself. And you check your motives in every single thing that you do. See, the hypocrite is really somebody who's insecure before God. They don't have the relationship. that they need. And so they do these things, they play act so that everybody around them thinks that. And listen, let's be honest, guys. Churches across America are full of them. Full of them. We're full of hypocrites. We're full of Pharisees. And since he has no security in God, he finds security in himself. That's what a hypocrite does. And so they just do these acts so that everybody else can see them. And since they don't have any security in God, they get security from people. And that's what he's talking about here. I've seen people that I thought in life were spiritual giants. And I see them somewhere else, and it's not just a mistake they make. We all make mistakes, don't get me wrong. It's a lifestyle they're living on the side. And it just breaks your heart. But then I've seen people too that I considered spiritual giants. And I think of a lady named Judy from the church that I grew up in and came from. You've heard me talk about her. She'd give testimonies every single time. Somebody said, "Do you have a testimony?" You knew Miss Judy was going to be the first to her feet. And just a spectacular lady. And as I became a teenager, and I, you know what it's like as a teenager. You're one way at church, sometimes you're a different way at school. You're a hypocrite at that point. And I would think, I wonder if people like Miss Judy or Etta May or Grandma Vera, I knew my grandma wasn't like that. I saw her everywhere. But I wonder if they're really these spiritual giants they proclaim to be. I went into 8th grade, switched schools, and I'm walking through the hallway, and there's Miss Judy. And she's a janitor at the school. I had no clue what she did for a living, but she was a janitor at the school. And the kids, you know how 8th, 9th, 10th graders can be, were not very nice to her at times. I never once saw her respond with an unkind word to them. I never once saw her act out of anything other than love. And I thought, maybe there's hope here. Maybe not everybody is like the people that I'm like here at school. Maybe there are real people who love God, and that's what God is looking for here. John, why don't you come? He started this passage with a simple word: beware. Beware. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Beware. Be aware is what that word means. Be aware. Look for it. Watch out for it. Which is perfect that we're taking communion. Because what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 11? He says, when you take the Lord's Supper, when you come together, he says, let a man examine himself. Right? He says, if you examine yourself, then there's no reason for anybody to judge you. In other words, what's he saying? Beware. Be aware. Look at yourself.